So we should probably say that this conversation is built around the concepts in the 8 concepts of Bowen Theory.
Right.
A new way of thinking about the individual and the group, written by Roberta Gilbert. And all of our coaches in Faithwalking, our presenters, really anybody deeply connected to Faithwalking, reads the first 5 chapters of this book. So let's start with chapter 1.
Yeah. And chapter 1 is about the nuclear...
The title of chapter 1 is The Nuclear Family Emotional System.
Yeah.
And what that means, just to unpack that a little bit, is the nuclear family is your first family, the family you were born into. And the emotional system just refers to the fact that we are deeply, even beyond our awareness, deeply connected in that first family.
When I first started reading this, I think the way Murray Bowen, who was the original author of some of this stuff, he talked about how the family is the molecule, and how different it is to the molecule of human relationships, and how every other system of thinking about human relationships has the individual as the basic unit. And I didn't understand that at first. I kept trying to make that make sense. And so how I came to that, how I came to making sense out of that, was not through family systems, but through organizational systems. And organizational systems, in fact, in Leading Congregational Change, we write about 7 kind of dynamics of systems. And one of them is that systems get what they're designed to get, and one of them is that every change changes everything. And one day, it was like a light came on, and I realized that what he was saying was, well, I'd say it this way. What he was saying was, when I was off at the Cynical 2 weeks ago on a silent retreat, man, I was the finest human being on the planet. I was generous, and I was loving, and I was patient. But it's the moment that I start having to interact with other people that I really care about, that my impatience or my self-centeredness or my selfishness. And so really I can't understand who I am and see who I am apart from seeing how I act in a family system, and that family system, somebody in that family system then acts with me, and there's this never-ending kind of, I don't even know how to, pings, P-I-N-G, pings, where I ping you and you ping me, and what is going on with us then influences Ken, and that's just, and that coming to see the relationships in terms of that basic system, that's the way you understand how we do relationships is really fundamentally different than thinking of me as the individual.
Right. I think the thing that jumps into my mind as you talk about that, Jim, is one of the things that really captured me was that anxiety within a system is infectious.
Yeah.
And so it runs through, so an entire congregation, if you're in a congregation, gets anxious if 2 or 3 people start getting anxious. And the other thought on the positive side of that, and that calmness is also infectious.
Right.
So that if I can calm myself, if I can manage my own anxiety, and just this idea of chronic anxiety and how it's under the surface, we don't see it, but there's a sense of threat that comes to us, and we're really threatened by something, and so we're afraid, and then we get reactive, and we have these typical habits of reacting to our anxiety. Then that is the way we respond, but then that becomes infectious to the whole group.
There are 2 pictures of that work for me. One is what's happening in us, and then one is what's happening between us. But when I actually do this stuff with kids sometimes in my office. And what I'll do with a kid is hold a soda can in my hand, and as we talk, I just kind of gesture with the soda can. And at some point, I'll hand the soda to the kid and say, "Would you open this?" And I don't work with oppositional defiant kids, so nobody's ever actually opened it in my office, but they'll always say, "No," because if I do that, it'll spew everywhere, everything that's, and that's the concept, that whatever's in us, as we get anxious, as we start getting stirred up, and that's what that anxiety is that stirred upness, as that starts to happen, our relationships are the mechanism that open the can, and whatever's in us comes out, usually in a really predictable, patterned way that we learned in that first family. The other image is vibrating.
Right.
So,
Right.
Right, so when I get anxious, I start vibrating, and if I'm connected to Ken, he starts vibrating. So try not to vibrate, Ken. See, he's got his muscles tight, and he's
Right.
trying not to vibrate, but he's still vibrating because I'm vibrating.
yeah, and if you were his dad, and he would go into that relationship with you and say, I'm not going to react the way I always react.
Right,
But then he's going to get with you, and you're vibrating the way you always vibrate, and then Ken will start to vibrate
right.
in the way he always does. And he'll walk away from that saying, oh, that's not who I wanted to be. But that's what anxiety does to us.
Well, so here's what I think is really important to get. I mean, it's what's been so powerful for me. And you said both of them, but I want to come back and tie these two things together. So I'm in a congregation, or I'm in a business where there's a group of people who work together. And just as we interact, there are breakdowns that occur, people do things, and they do them, and it reminds me of something that happened to me 10 years ago, but I'm not even conscious
Right.
of that. And so internally I'm getting stirred up, and then I'm going to express that stirred upness some way. We might talk about that in just a minute. But the thing you said at the very beginning was then those natural reactions to that are the things we learned in our family of origin.
Yeah, yeah. And people want to say, well, that was in my past.
Right.
You know, why do I have to think about what happened in my past? Jesus has saved me, and I'm not connected to my past anymore. But, you know, just like we got our physical DNA from those families, we also get our emotional DNA.
Yeah, in systems thinking, one of the sayings or one of the principles is that the past is always present.
Yeah.
And part of, for me, the power of understanding a family as a system and seeing how anxiety can define my behavior. The power of this has been that, first of all, it's just helped me to see that. I mean, for me, when I could just begin to see that when I interacted with you, it made me anxious, and that determined my behavior. Seeing that was just amazing to me. I mean, it was like, if I'm supposed to crucify, you know, this false self in me, or crucify the flesh, if I can't even see that, how can I crucify that?
Right.
And so once I could begin to see it, then I could begin to take some responsibility for it. And the other thing that it did was that it gave me hope that I wasn't always going to have to be that way. And you know, part of what helped me with that was how family systems defines how chronic anxiety. So it might be helpful to distinguish acute anxiety from chronic anxiety.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Yeah. How would you define the difference in that?
Well, I think acute anxiety is a real threat that's in the here and now.
Time dated.
It's like walking out into my driveway and there's a rattlesnake there.
Right.
And the interesting thing is that with acute anxiety, we all know how to deal with it. We
Right.
know what to do.
Right.
I'm going to go get a gun. I'm going to get a shovel. I'm going to call someone.
I'm going to run.
I'm going to get in a car.
Yeah, that's even before you think I'm going to get a gun, your body is already
Yeah.
Right.
designed to know how to deal with that.
Exactly.
You're going to
Right.
fight, or you're going to flee, or you're going to freeze.
Right.
Right.
And you are wired to know how to deal with that kind of threat.
Right.
And if we could just slow this conversation down for a minute for those who are listening in on the video, just learning to see that you that like my way of being is, if I think I can win, I'm going to fight, and if I think I'm going to lose, I'm going to flee. And I know those are patterns for me. And if you can just begin to see those patterns, that becomes really
Yeah.
powerful. Yes.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
the chronic. I mean, that's the acute anxiety.
That's acute anxiety. So then chronic anxiety is anxiety that is hidden under the surface, that I'm not really even maybe aware of.
Right.
And it's just a sense of threat to who I am, to my individuality, to myself. It's a sense of I'm not going to be heard, or I'm not going to be appreciated, or I'm not going to be accepted, or I'm not going to be included. Just, I mean, the list goes on and on. But it's a perceived threat.
Your life and your safety are not actually in danger.
Right.
But it feels like they're in
Exactly.
danger.
I have a really great story to tell about that. That was so powerful for me.
All your stories are great.
Long before I knew any of this language, I was working on the staff at the Western Hills Baptist Church in Fort Worth, Texas, And I'd been there about 3 months, and one day my senior pastor, Preston Bright, said, "So what's going on between you and Bob?" And I said, "Nothing that I know of. Why?" And he said, "Well, I've just noticed about you that you are a really gregarious person. You meet people, you remember things about them, when they, you move toward them, you smile, all of that. And I've noticed that when Bob comes in the room, you get really still. And if he moves towards you very quickly, I've actually watched you take a step or two back." And I said, "Really?" I mean, I was oblivious to that behavior. And he said, "Yeah." He said, "I don't know what that's about, but I just want to encourage you to pay attention." Well, what I know today that I didn't know then was, in my own growing up experience, there was some conflict between me and my dad that really was pretty deeply wounding. The good news is that God redeemed all of that, and as an adult we got that worked out. But I was 25 or so when I was in relationship to Bob, and I hadn't gotten that worked out. And the deepest part of my brain, Bob looked like my dad. I mean, physically, he looked like, he was built like him. He was an introvert like my dad was. He was kind of balding in the center of his head like my dad. There's just everything about his appearance and his kind of way of being reminded me of my dad, and it felt threatening to me. Now, he turned out to be one of my best friends, and he and his wife Beverly loved us as well as we've ever been loved by anybody. But there was no real threat, but it felt like a threat.
And that's what's really important, is that you could think, "Oh, this is one of my friends, this is a safe person."
Right.
But something more
Deeper.
Instinctive, something deeper was having a different reaction.
Right.
And we see that in couples, we see that between parents and children, and we see it between coaches and coachees.
Right.
And in any relationship, that is going on all the time.
Well, and what we teach in the Faithwalking community, where these coaches are being prepared, is that we teach that often chronic anxiety is tied to the deep woundings that happen to us, where vows emerge. And so we make vows about, I'm going to protect myself, I'm gonna find some way to keep from getting hurt like I got hurt in that moment of wounding. And so we develop habits. Like for me, when my dad would get when he'd get really tough with me and at times violent with me, I learned a way to be with him. And when I learned that way of being protected me, then I developed that as a set of habits. And by the time I was even 7 or 8 years old, I didn't think of those as a set of habits. That's just how I was. It's just who I was.
And not just with him.
And not just with him, but with every authority figure, and particularly male authority figures that I would come in contact with. And so it's been important for me to tie this chronic anxiety, first of all, is mostly invisible. And I feel threatened. The pattern of behavior is mostly invisible. I'm very present to the threat. But until I slow down and start observing, I'm not so clear about the pattern of behavior. One of the things I really like about Gilbert's book, and in this first chapter, is she talks about 4 different ways that we express our chronic anxiety that appear to be pretty universal in all cultures and all kinds of settings. They appear to be wired into the human brain.
One way we know that is that we can go all the way back to the beginning of the Bible and see all of them showing up.
Exactly.
Right. What I've discovered about those 4 typical ways also, Jim, is that it depends on the relationship and the setting. Which one of those is my preferred method?
Right.
The other day I was in, and by the way, I want to back up and say, one of the ways that I describe sometimes the chronic anxiety is that my buttons get pushed.
Yeah.
That's just a way that I think communicates to people, and I have these buttons and I don't even know who pushed them, and I don't know why. The other day I was teaching in a seminary class, and one of the students began to kind of argue with me a little bit.
Right.
And before I knew it, I was angry. And yeah, exactly. And really was right. And I said to myself, really? Why am I getting angry?
There's no threat here.
Exactly. And so I went home and began to explore that a little bit and realized that I have a button around that. And it goes to my family of origin. And the button is that my voice will be heard.
Uh-huh.
And here was a person that in some way was saying, no, I'm not going to listen to your voice.
Right.
And I, without even thinking about it, I perceived that as a threat.
Right.
And so in that moment, because I was the leader of the group, I was the teacher, conflict was my preferred method.
Right.
And so I verbally began to spar with the person.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that was out of my anxiety, and it was out of me not even thinking about it. Fortunately, I caught myself about 30 seconds into it and was able to coach myself in some ways that helped me get out of it. And I was also able then to do some self-awareness kinds of exercises on the way home and later that evening and discover what that button was about.
Well, so you've done one.
Yeah.
Sure.
You mean conflict?
Well, he's done conflict as
Yeah.
one of the 4 ways.
Yeah.
I have an over-under function.
Yeah,
story
I want to
tell.
talk a little more about conflict.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
And I also want to say I like that image of your buttons getting pushed. And there's a saying that goes around that says, you know, that the reason our families push our buttons is because they installed them. That's
really
you
good.
know,
I love that.
that's
I like
a good
that.
image about that.
Yeah.
But I just want to say about conflict that I want people to understand that conflict doesn't necessarily mean fighting.
Right.
As Christians, we can do conflict really nicely.
Right.
Yeah.
But that conflict is when I'm trying to win. You know, I'm trying to somehow come out on top.
Is
And
what-
I may be persuasive,
Right.
I may explain, and if you don't agree with me, I'll explain some more, and I may explain with a smile on my face, but I'm still trying to get an outcome where I get what I want, and that's conflict.
Yeah, and so the way I describe that sometimes is that conflict can be on a mild, you know, if it's on a continuum, it can just start and you and I have a friendly conversation where I'm trying to say, no, Tricia, I'm right and you're wrong. And if you'll just listen to me, I'll explain why. But the more intense the conflict becomes, it can result in, you know, in name calling, it can result in hitting someone, it can result in something that's much more intense, so it occurs on a continuum. But that persuasion is the kind of the action, and actually that's really it's really confusing for people like us who went to seminary and we got taught that our job is to persuade people.
Yeah, that you're supposed to figure
Right.
out what's the right answer and
And
then
then
make
give the
sure
right
everybody
answer.
else gets on board with that.
Exactly.
And so,
Exactly.
anytime I'm using language like, how do I get somebody to do such and such? How do I get somebody to think such and such? I'm at that very beginning stage of conflict. And
Well, so one of the ways that, let's do those 4 ways of chronic
Yeah.
anxiety. The first one Ken just did was conflict. One of them is what's called overfunction, underfunction. And if you really know the language, it's overfunction, underfunction, reciprocity.
which just means that it's...
Right, exactly.
Mhm.
So in many ways, I'm a classic overfunctioner. Y'all know the story of us going to Montrose and helping start Harbor Church, and we ended up in this work with people in recovery from drugs and alcohol addiction. And what I can only see looking back, I didn't see it in the moment, was that we would connect to these mostly young men, and when they would tell their stories, I had a very appropriate response of compassion. It was like, "Oh, I hate to hear how much you've suffered," and then those compassion buttons got triggered, and my response was, "Let me fix that for you. Let me take responsibility for." And now that was not a conscious thought. It wasn't like, "So I know what to do, and you don't know what to do, and I'm going to tell you." But actually, when I look back on my behavior, that's exactly what would happen.
Because you are not only feeling compassionate, you're also feeling anxious.
The compassion, that's the
Right.
connection that I made, was that I felt compassion, and then out of my compassion I could begin to see all of the hurt that they were in. I could see all the implications of the lifestyle they were living. I could see a future that they were going to be living into that they said they didn't want and that I didn't want for them. And so then what would happen is I would overfunction, and I would overfunction by giving advice and had all kinds of things that they needed to do. And in my overfunctioning, I could become very persuasive. And the classic deal was, the more I overfunctioned, the more they underfunctioned. They were perfectly happy for me to take responsibility for their lives.
Right.
And it was a long time before I could see that rather than actually supporting them as they took responsibility for their life, what I was doing was actually acting out of my anxiety, trying to fix them, and not really helping them at all, because it wasn't my compassion they were experiencing, it was my anxiety they were experiencing, which made them anxious, and then they did what they do when they get anxious, which is to underfunction.
Which, all of that, Jim, stirs up in me, not any anxiety, but this thought that our chronic anxiety also results in some physiological things
Oh,
that
yeah.
happen to us.
Yeah.
I get a knot in my gut.
My chest burns.
Yeah. And so when I get anxious, and this comes from family of origin also, I know I'm responsible for the anxiety,
Right.
and all I want to do is get rid of the anxiety.
Right.
I just want to feel better.
And so in that setting, what I learned was that if I would give advice, I would
Right.
feel better,
You'd feel
and
better.
they would go away. Because they didn't want any more of that advice, and the anxiety would go away.
Yeah.
Or they'd be compliant for a little while.
Exactly,
And that
yeah,
made the anxiety
exactly.
go away.
But the moment anxiety came back to them and their compliance, because they weren't deeply committed to any of this, then they were right back in the same place they were, which then made, I mean, you just begin to see how the anxiety got passed back and forth, and we got more and more anxious.
And one of the reasons this is important for us in our coaching is that most people who sign up to coach tend to overfunction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, underfunctioners don't tend to sign up to become coaches. And so
I've never thought about that, but that's true.
overfunctioners are always saying about underfunctioners, you know, they're slackers, they don't take responsibility, they're not doing enough. The problem is that anywhere there's an underfunctioner, there's an overfunctioner.
Right.
That's the reciprocity part of it. So, you know, if I'm saying that you're underfunctioning and I'm in close relationship with you, chances are I'm the overfunctioner. And we reward overfunctioners. And a lot of our coaches have been rewarded by the church, by society, in their families for overfunctioners and for overfunctioning, and we blame underfunctioners. We have to remember they come as a package deal.
Yeah. 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 So so conflict is one. Over under functioning reciprocity is the second one. What's the third expression?
Distancing.
Distancing.
And actually, Bowen says that's the one we're always doing all the time.
And remember,
Yeah.
these
in
are
different
four
ways.
expressions of how we react to chronic anxiety.
Right.
So,
Right.
So what?
Yeah, I'm a classic distancer.
Are you?
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that my preferred style is conflict when I'm in charge.
That's what I experience most of the time. I'm wishing you'd distance me a little more.
When I'm not in charge, I distance, and I shut down. I get quiet. I go off. I don't say anything, and I eventually my distancing results in triangling.
which is the fourth one.
So that I can get rid of my anxiety.
Right.
But distancing, is seen in all sorts of ways. One way is just over-involvement in our hobbies or doing what we enjoy doing. Workaholism is a form of distancing. And the issue is that the anxiety is so great that I can't face the anxiety or the cause or the person that I'm in. And so let's say it's between my wife and I. I don't have the courage to tell her what's so for me.
Right.
And so I distance from her because I'm afraid of the conversation.
Yeah.
And I hate to talk about, and we hate to say we're afraid of anything. Oh, I'm not afraid of anything. Yeah, we are afraid. We're afraid to have that conversation.
So distancing is and I don't ever talk about me and Betty except when I have permission to do that. And she and I have both been on this journey of learning this language and learning these ideas and applying them in our lives. And one of the things we recognized somewhere along the way was we could stay together in a certain amount of conflict, but at some point in the conflict, she was going to cry and I was going to go away. And her crying was an attempt for her to go away, to distance, and I would physically go away. I'd say, oh, whatever is going on in our lives, it doesn't matter enough that I want you to cry about that. And so whatever it was we were working on, we could get to a certain point, but we could never make any breakthroughs around that, because when the manifestations of the anxiety became too intense, then we'd just step away. And
Which you thought was a way of avoiding bad things happening.
well, yeah, it was
We
like
don't want to fight. We
I
don't
got
want to
taught that
say
was a way to
mean
love my
things.
wife. You know,
Yeah.
nobody who loves their wife wants them to cry when they're having
Right.
conversations. What you know?
Right.
Yeah, where we see that in coaching all the time, where I see it, is I'm coaching someone and they start not showing up for calls, or they start being really superficial in the call, or they start trying to reschedule the calls a lot, and don't seem real invested. and they are distancing very often as a response to their own anxiety. And then that makes me anxious, and being a fellow distancer, I kind of forget to email them or to call them and follow up. I say to myself, well, I don't want to overfunction. But what's really happening, is it makes me anxious to think about moving toward their anxiety. And so I can distance too, and after a while, it's possible that a long time can go by and we haven't touched base. And that's sometimes what distancing looks like in that relationship.
So in responses to chronic anxiety or conflict over underfunctioning, distancing, and then there's a fourth one.
Projection, which
Projection
shows
or
up as a
triangle.
couple of ways, triangling and blaming being the two big ones.
Right.
The whole point of projection is that we're trying to move the anxiety away from us. And the way that shows up in a triangle is there's anxiety here. So somehow we figure out a way to offload some of that onto Jim, right?
So one of you comes and says, Kim comes and says, you won't believe what Tricia said.
Right.
Or, and so he feels better because he's expressed, he's vented his feelings. But
Right.
now I've got, if I'm not a well-defined person, then all of a sudden I'm anxious that y'all's relationship isn't going well, and I'm taking on, so what do I need to do to fix that? How do I
Right.
overfunction in this deal?
And meanwhile, I may have no clue that
Exactly.
there's even anything going on.
Right.
I'm on the outside position of that triangle.
Right.
You may keep the triangle going by coming and talking to me.
Exactly.
And Ken may go to you with a lot of anger. You won't believe what Tricia just did. He could come to you and say, please help me.
Right.
I need help with this. Or, it may not even look like a problem. It might look really healthy. But what's happening is that he's not talking to me.
Right.
He's not connecting to me. In fact, he's distancing from me, and he's taking the anxiety that actually belongs here and putting it
Right.
there.
And we call that venting sometimes.
And we do.
I just need somebody to vent. So I come and I call you and I vent. And what ends up happening is I just gave him all my anxiety. And so I feel better. The issue between you and I isn't resolved at all.
Right.
Right.
But I feel so much better because what's the main goal? Get rid of the knot in my gut. And I just got rid of the knot in my gut and gave it to Jim.
Now, Tricia was the one who taught me that there actually is such a thing as a positive triangle.
Right.
And what that would look like is that goes on between y'all, and I'm a person who's got enough emotional maturity not to take on your anxiety, so I listen and you vent, because we know that when the feeling processes are stirred up, the thinking processes are shut down.
Right.
So you vent, and slowly the feeling process stuff gets turned down. And in a good triangle, what I do is I say, so what are you going to do about that? What do your values and beliefs tell you about how you're going to work that out with her? Do you have some ideas about how you might go back and get that worked out with her? And so all the responsibility stays there, and in a positive triangle, that venting becomes a good thing.
Right.
If you're not a mature person, you won't like that, and you'll never go vent to him again. You'll find someone else to triangle
Right.
with.
Who will leave it there.
Who will leave it there.
Who won't tell me to go talk
Right.
to you, because that's not what I want to
But if you
hear.
are working on maturity, then
Right.
you'll be able to hear that again, and you'll come and work it out with me.
Absolutely.
Now you said that one way that projection happens is through triangling, the other way is through blaming.
Is through blaming, which is just another way of taking this anxiety I feel and making it go away by putting it on someone else.
It's your fault.
It's your fault,
Yep.
right? It's not me, it's you.
Yeah.
And that's pretty self-explanatory.
And
We do that a
after
lot.
all, you did a whole lot of bad things to me.
Absolutely, yeah, right. And I'm not responsible in that moment. I'm going to
Right.
give you all the responsibility
Right.
for my bad feelings.
It's totally your fault.
And, right.
So, for chronic anxiety in 4 ways that are just universally present. How do you use this information? How has having information about chronic anxiety and ways that it gets expressed, how does that help you in your marriage? How does it help you in your coaching? How does it help you in your work as a pastor or a therapist? I think it would be helpful to talk about just practical ways this works itself out in our lives.
Right. Right.
So like if you know you're a distancer, which you've said, you know that about yourself.
Right.
And you know that you feel anxiety first as a knot in your gut.
Right. Well, I think Ronald Richardson in one of his books quoted Alice in Wonderland when he said, "Don't just do something, stop." And the idea is that the first thing to do is just don't do what we always have done.
Right.
And so recognizing, I think the self-awareness component of recognizing what our typical patterns of behaving when anxiety emerges are, is a good thing. And according to Richardson, he says that just that thought alone is progress.
That if you can just think, I have that thing in my gut,
Right.
and I know that what I tend to do in this relationship is to distance. I
Right.
don't want to do that. How am
Right.
I going to stay connected?
Yeah, I mean, you're the one who taught me that if I can become aware of the anxiety, and so you have a conversation and you begin to say, you said you feel it in your gut, it's for me, it's just burning in my chest. Just noting that began to give me more heightened awareness of it. And you're the one who said to me I remember this from 10 years ago, you said, at whatever point, whether it's the moment it happens or 5 seconds or 5 minutes, the moment you get aware that that internal fizzing is going on, just stop and stand still and take deep breaths.
Take deep breaths.
That alone was revolutionary in my life.
Yeah.
Um,
Right. Well, you said it a moment ago, when our anxiety goes up, our thinking stops.
Right.
And so we quit being able to process. And it's the point that I talk about following the way of Jesus. So Jesus said, love your neighbor like you love yourself, and love your enemies. And when everything's calm, I do fairly well with that.
Right.
Until my neighbor really pushes one of my buttons.
Exactly.
And then I don't like him anymore, and I get anxious, and my anxiety rises. And when my anxiety rises, I just automatically kick into these reactive behaviors, and I quit thinking about those values and those principles that I said that I believe. And so I ignore them, and it's why good Christian people fight. And so if we can stop and calm ourselves, begin to lower our anxiety, and then begin to get our thinking back in gear, then we can think about what our principles and priorities are.
And so honestly, that's chapter 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.